We come now to Unit 9, where the focus is on Part 1 of your research for your final exegetical paper. This is an intermediate stage I'm calling the literary and rhetorical analysis of your chosen passage. So this will again be a preparation, but work at what I call a Hebrew from the inside out. In my dissertation work back in the early 1980s, where I did a study of the rhetorical structures that are part of Jeremiah's idolatry polemics. I discovered a new realm of the Hebrew literary nature, and that's what I call the Hebrew from the inside out, and looking at Hebrew in its unique, today we use the terminology of systemic linguistics and structural aspects of the text that are just part of the nature of the Hebrew language, and in this case, your study of various oracles, sometimes narrative in your chosen passage, and how the language itself works. We call systemic functional linguistics, has to do with how language functions, human nature and human communication. There's a whole unique study. So much going on in the world of literary and linguistic studies today. And so what I want you to do is get an idea of how to, the level of your Hebrew study now, to really get into the heart, the meat of the text, and how Hebrew works. Once explaining this whole idea to one of our preaching professors back years ago, I said, really it gets down to, how Jeremiah put his sermons together. His oracles in various settings, addressing the people, the kings, temple worship that we looked at in the previous session, and so forth. But how you put the messages together, and how various aspects of literary design can help us in understanding the full meaning of the biblical text. So in this literary rhetorical analysis section, I've kind of outlined it in several steps, which are found in the Blackboard notes on this section. So I call this step 1, to analyze the content of the Hebrew text, looking for rhetorical elements or rhetorical devices. Now there is a separate rhetorical devices handout in Blackboard, but this section I simply outlined to look for these various items. One is repetition. We use repetition a lot in varying ways in our language, in our sermon and teaching planning sessions and so forth. But recurring elements can be individual words, various forms, phrases, sometimes even endings. Psalm 23 rings over and over again with these first person pronominal suffixes, the Hirik Yod endings, such as, where it begins, Adonai Ro'i, my shepherd, Adonai Ro'i lo exar beneot deshe yarbit seini, and then it continues on with these Hirik Yod endings. And so one of the things you look at in Psalm 23 is the use of the recurring first person endings. A second element is chiastic structure, or chiasmus. That is a repetition of elements in the telling of a story in sequence, but moving toward a center and then out of the center, so that you'll have parallel sections, what we call like A, B, C, followed by C prime, B prime, A prime. And so it reverses, with the focus being in a chiastic structure on that middle convergence of the movement of the text in and out of the given focus of the passage. So chiasmic structures are often helpful in understanding what is the key message and seeing what aspects of the message are primary versus secondary. And sometimes those can be confused. in the way the English text is often arranged. And so in the Hebrew text, we look for how these structures are playing out in the setting forth of the given message. A third area is looking for parallel structure. So as chiasmus moves toward a center and out, parallel structures are repetitious. So you would have like an A section, B section, C, followed by an A prime, B prime, C prime. And so that's parallel kinds of structures that we see in another larger form of repetition. Another aspect of rhetorical analysis is thematic development. This includes the aspect of repetition, but it's repetition in developing additional ideas along the given theme. And so it's kind of a mushrooming effect along a given theme. In some cases, you have moving from point A to point B to point C, expansion in the text. There are several really good examples. For example, even in the creation narrative of Genesis 1, as you move from day 1 to day 3, there are expanding elements as you move through the phases of creation. And then when you go to days 4 through 6, which is a parallel structure, because day 1 is paralleled by the material of day 4. Day 1 is the setup, day 4 is the conclusion. So day 1, creation of light. Day 4, the elements of light, sun, moon, stars, are created. So these are parallel structures, but developing the theme of God's working toward the apex of his creation, which is day 3 in the realm as we move into the earth, and the day is filled with animals, and then finally humanity. So it's expansive and is developing what we sometimes refer to as a crescendo, using that musical term, in the creation narrative. There are other parallels in thematic developments of the theme of God's work in creation, bringing his ultimate creation, that of humanity, male and female, in his image, into focus and then responsibility. So again, how themes are developed in the text. So you can find parallels to that also in, for example, the narrative of the Day of Atonement in Leviticus chapter 16, many other places in the Old Testament text. Number 5 in this is Inclusio, which defines the parameters often of a section or pericope, a fancy term for a definable portion of text that begins and ends with a repetition of the same or similar elements. So it can be at or near the beginning and at the end of the passage. So it can be a word, a phrase, or a concept. Number 6 in the rhetorical elements are mnemonic devices, that which facilitated memory, using things such as acrostics, where you go through, like you have a number of psalms. The supreme example, of course, is Psalm 119, where you have repetition of 8 times each of the letters of the Hebrew alphabet. Sometimes it's assonance and alliteration, similar things that we use in our teaching and preaching outlines as well. Finally, the use of varieties of metaphors and similes and other literary devices as illustration elements, comparative. We looked at, for example, yesterday in the discussion of Jeremiah chapter 2, where he uses the metaphors of donkeys and camels to describe Israel's passion for seeking other gods. So again, metaphors, similes. So the various rhetorical devices that are used in the biblical text. And so as you begin working with your chosen passage, step 1 is to look for those, identify them, and see how they're working in the text. Step 2 in the rhetorical analysis and literary analysis is looking at the actual Hebrew text and how it flows out of. One of the problems in the layout in our biblical text of the Hebrew, your BHS, your Biblia Hebraica, Stucartensia, is that it often is not organized the way that the Hebrew text itself flows, especially in passages of the prophets where you're moving sometimes between narrative and poetic oracles, following these poetic structures, and they're not often outlined. So what I want you to do is get a Hebrew text, and I can, if you have a problem working with a Hebrew text, I can provide you a good text that is relatively easy to work with in doing. But I want you to do a block diagram layout of the Hebrew text. In the course documents on Blackboard, I've provided you a variety of examples from different biblical texts using both narrative and poetics in how to do this. I use, for example, as you'll see in the various samples on Blackboard, different colors to show different kinds of elements that are repeated and provide insight into the structure. So you'll align, starting of course with Hebrew being on the right, your right hand margin, and then indent inward from the right according to how the text flows out in the various sections, whether it's narrative or poetic structures, you'll see. And one of the things we actually talk about in the linguistic studies of the Hebrew text is many times, even in narrative, there is a substructure of poetics in the way that the text, and kind of goes back to the history of how people in the biblical world thought in various patterns. So again, alignments according to starting with your right hand margin of your various elements with, for example, your introduction. Like we've had a lot of examples in Jeremiah as you look through that it will start out with that phraseology that the word of the Lord came to me, Vayehi Devar Adonai Eli. That would be your farthest to the right beginning element in the outline of the biblical text, and then indent one indentation space. You can indent, you set up your indentations as you like, according to whether you do 4 spaces, 5 spaces, any kind of systemic or systematic indentation will work in this outlay. Note also syntactical structures, repeated verb forms, such as your Vav consecutive imperfects. If you have repeated imperatives and others, highlight those repeated elements either in bold or a color background for your text. And again, you're going to work toward looking at how the actual text of your Hebrew lays out in the flow of the document. I think will give you some additional insight into how the particular sections of your passage are setting forth the argument that Jeremiah is making. Step 3 in this then is to take what you've done in rhetorical analysis and literary structure to bring it together in a discussion. In this part, you will fully discuss the internal development of the Hebrew text of your passage, and if needed, even looking at how this particular passage fits into the flow of the larger narrative. Sometimes you may be choosing one pericope out of a lengthy chapter as the focus of your passage, so you would want to give a kind of background introduction. Also, if there are any background elements, that is, biblical backgrounds, we talk about the contributions or understanding of history and archaeology and the setting of the text. But again, focus will be on explaining exactly what's going on in the movement of the text. Now, this is not simply a commentary, but explaining how the text itself is moving from point A to point B in the setting forth of the dynamics of the Hebrew rhetoric and the patterns of prophetic messages. In some cases, step 4 would be a characterization study. May or may not be applicable. Characterization study might be if you did your passage relative to Hananiah or Pashur, that you might want to do a characterization study. And there are materials in Blackboard that will help you to understand what a characterization study is. And then finally, your presentation, and in the material that's on Blackboard, I have an outline of how then you would set up your presentation, which you will hand in. Again, this is due a week after the spring break week. So it gives you this particular week, Unit 9, to work through structural, literary, and rhetorical analysis, focusing upon how the Hebrew text itself develops the message of this particular Jeremiah passage that you've chosen.